we can get started with the presentation. And I'll go ahead and send a mute out to everybody so we don't get any background noise. And yeah, so my name is Daniel Tana. I am the one of the planner coordinators for the Historic Preservation section of the Prince George's County Planning Department. And we manage this program that's called the Historic Property Grant Program. This is the 13th year of the program. And I guess, it's had a pretty robust history. I'm trying to think of how many awards we've actually given away. And last year, it was about $3.8 million in that time that the Prince George's County Planning Board has awarded to people. So this is actually a program of the Planning Board. We, as their staff, administer it, but they make the ultimate decisions on who receives awards, and they set the regulations and guidelines for the program. So that's just a little bit of back story for the program. And then really quickly, I wanted to go through those documents that you all should have received when you registered for the workshop. Like I said, they're going to be kind of useful probably if you have them on hand. So you should have received 5 things, which would be the instructions for the program, the application, supplemental photo pages, which you may or may not need to actually use, a sample grant contract, which sort of gives you the boilerplate language that you would find if you are selected to receive an award from the planning board. This is the first contract that you would sign, sort of agreeing to the terms of the award. And then there should be an easement frequently asked questions document. Now that is in lieu of a sample easement. We, in the past, have provided folks with a sample easement, but because the easements are kind of tailored for each property, that has been confusing in the past. So our legal department is working on one, and when it's ready, everyone who I have an email address for through your registration, I can send a sample easement out to if you haven't already seen one. But for the time being, this easement FAQ kind of explains how the easement functions. And I thought that might be better to start with and maybe a little bit easier. So yeah, without further ado, I'll get into the meat of it now. This is the very quick purpose about the grant program. The purpose of it is to assist in the protection, preservation, and enhancement of historic properties through the award of historic property grants. This year, the maximum size of an individual grant is $50,000. So that is the most that you can request and the most that you could be awarded. And there is a total of $350,000 available to be awarded. So it's a great time to remind everybody that it is a competitive program. If everybody requests that $50,000, it goes pretty quickly. And not that many people will receive it. So keep that in mind. It is not guaranteed. The funding of this program is not guaranteed, but it is available. So I encourage everybody to try their best. And that's what you'll learn how to do here today. Really quickly, I feel like it's worth kind of defining a few things. So for the purpose of this program, when we talk about historic properties, we are talking about designated county historic sites and resources. We're also talking about properties that are either individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places or who are listed or are contributing to National Register Historic Districts. And then we're also talking about properties that are contributing to our locally designated historic districts like Old Town College Park. And one of the National Register ones would be like Hyattsville, places like that. So all of these types of historic properties are eligible for this program. You don't need to be a county designated historic site yet. You don't necessarily need to be, any one of these things at this point to apply. And then in terms of, you would have to have affiliation with one of those types of properties. And then you can also be an individual, a nonprofit, an incorporated municipality, and nonprofits include churches, religious organizations, things like that. So it's pretty much open to almost anyone in the state that has one of those qualifying property types, other than the state government and things like that. So if you have one of those eligible historic properties, you are probably an eligible applicant, unless you are from the state of Maryland or something like that. And then just a quick note for eligible applicants, if you've been through the process before and were successfully awarded a grant award, you do have to wait one grant year in between reapplying. So if you had received one last year in FY 2020, you would need to kind of take this year off, spend down what you received from last year, and then you could reapply for the 2022 grant year. And just quickly, because it confused me when I first started, this is the current grant year that's open that you would be submitting applications for right now is FY 2021. And so that's tied to our fiscal year for the state and for the commission, which begins on July 1st. So our fiscal year 2021 started July 1st, and that's when this year's grant cycle was funded. So it's tied to that, and it it's a little confusing because everything is a year ahead of where we currently are, but the awards will actually be determined in the next calendar year. So the FY 2021 stuff ends up being usually kind of decided on in calendar year 2021, if that makes any more sense. And apologies if it actually made it more confusing for any of you, but I hope that that's not the case. So really quickly, I wanted to go through that contract, sample contract that you have in front of you. It's a couple pages long, but the main conditions that you want to be aware of in that contract are these 6 here. The first one is, as I mentioned, you only have to be one of these historic properties, which is a sort of overarching category that includes a few different things to apply. However, if you are selected to receive an award, you have to, as one of the conditions to receive the funds, you have to agree to become and be designated a Prince George's County Historic Site. So, that's something to keep in mind, because when you become a historic site, you then have additional regulatory oversight that comes from the planning department via subtitle 29 of the county code, which is the county's historic preservation ordinance. So that's just something to keep in mind. The second thing is that all work that's done to your property now and in the future has to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. Generally, we use the rehabilitation standards, which provide the most flexibility. The 10 standards are listed in the application instructions. So if you flip towards the back of the application instructions document, those will be in there, and you can kind of take a look at them. And they aren't rigid prescriptions. They're very much guidelines. So they do leave some flexibility in terms of how you want to do things in ways that is appropriate to the kind of work that we would need to see done. The third thing is the grantee must provide a 10% match of the gross award amount. So if you were successful in receiving a $50,000 grant award, you would have to then put up a $5,000 match. And that can be matched in either cash, but it doesn't have to be. It can be in-kind matches of labor and materials, and donated services, things like that, use of equipment. This money can be raised and spent during the grant period. You don't have to necessarily have it in the bank right now while you're applying. And it's a fairly low grant match requirement. So I feel like that's worth pointing out. A lot of other capital grants especially have a much higher match that's required. So we try to make this lower so that it's accessible to more people, while you still have a little, you're still showing that you have some skin in the game. The next one is the easement, which I've sort of mentioned before, and I will get into in a little more depth towards the end of my presentation. So if you agree to accept a grant, the planning board selects you from all of the applicants. You receive a notification of that, and you decide to sign the grant contract. One of the terms of the contract is the requirement to then donate a perpetual historic preservation easement to the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, which is M-NCPPC, which is the planning department's sort of parent organization. The reason we do that is to, protect the public money that's going to be invested into your privately owned historic site, or in the case of municipalities, publicly owned historic site. It functions in practice a lot like being designated as a historic site for most grant recipients, in that it protects the exterior of the property and requires us to review prove changes to the exterior of the property, but it is not the same as that. It does have some differences that I'll get into later. But yeah, so that's one thing that you kind of have to be really comfortable with, and it's often one of the big stumbling blocks for people. So just keep that in mind. That has to happen before any of these grant funds get released. And then another thing that has to happen before grant funds are released is the work actually has to be completed. Now, what that means, it doesn't mean that if you have this huge $50,000 project that you have to complete the whole thing before you can get reimbursed, because we know that that would be difficult for most people probably, but it does mean that there is no lump sum upfront payment of the grant money. We also can't pay your contractors directly or anything like that. The way that it works is that if you let's say you have a $50,000 project and your contractor is invoicing you monthly. You could come to us with a monthly invoice of $2,000, $3,000, whatever it is, and showing that you have paid that invoice, proof of payment to the contractor, and then some photos of the completed work so that we can verify that it was done to the specifications that were agreed upon. And then the commission will then issue you a reimbursement check for that amount of money. So that's how it works. It is reimbursable only, and it is for completed work only. So you kind of have to, that's one other way that we make sure that the work is being done in the way that it needs to be done, and that these public funds are protected. The last bit, speaking of that reimbursement, is that grant awards may be taxable. So if you're, here on behalf of a nonprofit, that this isn't probably going to affect you. But if you are an individual who pays income taxes, you should know that your grant, for every reimbursement that goes out in a given calendar year, M-NCPPC will issue the grant recipients a Form 1099, which will give the amount of money that has been issued to you, paid out from the commission. So if you're an individual, that may end up being a tax liability for you. So we just recommend, we can't really offer any advice on that otherwise, but we do recommend that you, if you're concerned about it, talk to your tax preparer or whoever to make sure that your specific situation won't be affected in any serious ways that you are not willing to deal with, I guess. Just we want to make sure that everybody's comfortable with that and aware of it before we start reimbursing money, so that it doesn't come as a surprise to anyone. So really quickly, I will just go through this timeline of the grant process. I oftentimes, when I'm speaking to people about this in person, point out that it's kind of a long process. So, if you've got a leaky roof that needs to be fixed like next week, this is probably not the way to go about funding it. But the most important date for you all right now is October 16th, 2020. That is the application due date. We require that everyone gets in an application by that date, substantially completed. But then we do allow between October 16th and November 20th for people to submit additional information. So on the 16th, at that date, that cutoff time, planning department staff will start reviewing applications. We'll go through, we'll see if anything, is missing that we need, or if there's stuff that we feel like could be clarified or improved. The staff are not the ones who actually score the applications and provide recommendations to the planning board, but we do have some sense of what they're looking for. So our role in this process is to both collate your information and provide it to those bodies that then make the decisions, but also to provide applicants with technical assistance and advice. So this doesn't mean that on October 16th you can kind of hand in an application that has one or two of the questions filled out and then do the rest in that subsequent month. What we really like to see is a substantially completed grant application with all of the necessary attachments, and then we can review those and again, help you get it into really, really good shape, as competitive as possible by November 20th when it's finalized. And then after that date, no changes can be made. So from November to December, staff work behind the scenes. It says scanning applications, which is not really relevant this year. But we get everything combined and collated and sort of standardized, put into a binder that goes to the grant committee, and then it goes to the HPC, the Historic Preservation Commission, in February. It's presented to them. And then after that, it gets presented to the planning board. Each one of these presentations, the previous body has made scoring recommendations, and those are presented to the subsequent bodies. And then it finally gets presented to the planning board in March, who takes all of that feedback from these other bodies and makes final award determinations. And they are the ones who will formally vote on a set of recommendations. They may change the award amounts a bit. They can do whatever they want, really, because it is their funding. It's their money that funds the program. But you should find out usually by March if you're getting an award. And this all is a little bit subject to change this year because we just don't really know what the spring will bring. But this is how it usually happens in a given year. So we hope that it'll largely be able to stick to this timeline. After March, when the planning board makes their decision, we usually get those grant contracts out to folks within a few weeks. They don't take too long to draft because we already have the boilerplate prepared. So they get routed internally, approved, and then they get sent off to you all for signature. The grant awardees will send them back to us, and then we send them to our executive director's office up in Riverdale Park for counter signature. And then that's when the fun begins and we start working on the easement process. So for people who are coming back for subsequent grants, you don't have to worry about that. You are kind of good to go and start doing work as soon as your grant contract is fully executed. But for new people who are coming into this for the first time, starting in May and June is when we get into the easement process. And that is a long process. It can take several, months to over a year, depending on the specific property. One of the things that we have to navigate with that process is if you have a mortgage or other encumbrances on your title that would come up in a title search, we have to resolve those in some way. So for a typical mortgage, that your average homeowner has, that's generally handled via a mortgage subordination with your lender. And that's something that we will help you navigate. We can, offer documentation and statements to try to get your lender on board with that. But, knowing that all will have to happen, it may be worth talking to your respective lenders and note holders, if you're still feeling serious about this after this workshop, just to start to have that conversation. Because if you are among the ones that get selected for an award, it will have to happen eventually. So just keep that in mind. And then that's also the time where the work that you're proposing in your grant application, if it's awarded, that means that it's likely approvable work. But because of the requirement to become a historic site, you will then have to start working on your HAWPs. So whether you are a historic site or are not yet one, you will ultimately have to have a historic area work permit, which is a HAWP, on file to do the work. So that's a great time to start working on that process too, because those work permits are good for 2 years. So you can certainly have those, ready to go. So once your easement is recorded, you can hit the ground running. And then for most people, for everyone actually, the work, grant funded work, cannot begin until that easement has been recorded. So again, for people who already have the easement from an earlier grant, that is good to go once your grant contract is signed. But for everybody else, you can't really start doing any work that you would want to seek reimbursement for until you've gotten that easement recorded. So really quickly, I guess, before I jump into the application, which is the kind of next thing I was going to go through step by step, does anyone have any upfront questions or anything like that they don't feel like sitting on until later? Okay, I see somebody in the chat. Sure, yeah, go ahead if you want to type.
Hi, Daniel. This is James Albert and Amy Carter. Hey. Our camera's muted because I'm having a bad hair day.
That's okay.
So we have a question on intercepting the approval of the HOP until the potential award. Okay. We have a pretty gnarly basement project, and we might be considering having that completed in advance of the grant award. would it be possible to get approval to the HOP prior to the potential award?
So yes, you could certainly get the HAWP approved before the award, but again, if that work that you're talking about is work that you intend to have reimbursed through the grant program, it would not be able to be completed before the awards are actually made and all that stuff and the grant contract is signed. Because you already have an easement on that property, you don't have to worry about that, but we do have to wait until the grant contracts are signed. So that would be, any work that was done before April or May, when those are executed, would not be eligible for reimbursement. So you can certainly have the work permits approved in advance, but hold off on actually doing the work until.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I see another question in the chat. So I'm going to read that one out to everybody. Question from Sachin is the easement grant reversible at any point in the future? That's a great question. It is. I mean, in some ways, I guess, and I may not be understanding specifically what you mean, but I'll give you a few examples that I hope will answer the question. So let's say you submit an application and it's all settled. Everything's done. It looks great. It's finished on November 20th. If you change your mind before the grants are awarded, that is 100% fine. If you change your mind after the planning board has said, yes, Sachin, you are getting this $50,000 grant that you applied for, you can still change your mind. You can have received the grant contract, signed it, and returned it. And that grant contract does have language in it that allows you to change your mind. So you can say, you know what? I've gotten to the point of negotiating this easement. I've thought about it some more, and I don't really think I want to do this. And it could be because of the easement. It could be for any reason. Maybe you, are out and you just stumble upon a suitcase of money that you're allowed to keep, or whatever it is. You come into some inheritance and you just think, well, now I don't really necessarily feel like I need this source of funding to do this work. That's totally fine. We don't want anyone feeling like they have to take the grant money or that they have to have the easement recorded. Obviously the easement is a requirement of receiving the grant funds, but we don't want anyone going through with it if they're not comfortable. So we do provide many opportunities for people to change their mind and kind of back out of it along the way. And it has happened in the past where we've, for one reason or another, people have gone ahead with the easement, but then they've ended up not actually starting the work. And that's okay too. Of course, you then have the easement recorded. So it's probably much better for you to make that decision before signing and executing and recording the easement. But there is the possibility, even if you go to that point in the process and the easement gets recorded, if you don't take any of the money, like if you don't do any work that gets reimbursed by the grant fund, even at that point, there is the possibility through a mutual agreement between the grantee and the commission to potentially even get rid of the easement. So it would be difficult, and like I said, it's probably in your best interest to try to make the decision before that point. But yes, there are multiple kind of opportunities to reverse it. Otherwise, if you meant in terms of reversing the easement later on after having received the money, then no, that is not generally possible because the easements are required to be perpetual. So that's something to keep in mind, and I can get into more about why that is a little bit later in the presentation during the easement section. And then I see one more question here from Angela Porter. You spoke of the fact that the easement can take up to a year to complete. Yes, that is correct. Ideally, it doesn't. For a property that, if you own outright or something like that, and there's nothing to subordinate and the title is clean, it just takes as long as it takes for our legal staff to draft it, basically. The process as it kind of usually runs is that we request after the grant contracts have been signed, you'll get an email from staff sort of giving you next steps. We have a little flow chart that we'll send you all with a sort of "you are here" location arrow on it, so you can see what you need to do next. And usually the next step for people that don't have an easement recorded already through a previous grant is to send us a property survey, like a legal property survey of the property. And then our legal staff uses that and publicly available records like from the State Department of Assessments and Taxation to draft up the easement. And then we will come out and document the property and prepare all of these exhibits that go with the easement, send it to you when they're all ready. And then you have that to review, with any of your lawyers or whoever else might want to see it. And then, when you're comfortable with it, we arrange a settlement, and that's kind of that. The ones where it can take a long time are ones that have multiple title issues. We've had some where when we have our attorney do research on the title, it turns out that there could be several liens that sometimes the property owner is as surprised about as we are, and those, due to the nature of our easements and the requirement that they are perpetual, we have to make sure that we have a clear title to record on, because any title encumbrances like deeds of trust for mortgages and liens, things like that, can if they have been recorded on the title to the property that's receiving the grant funds before the easement was recorded, they then have the power, if they are foreclosed upon or acted upon, to sort of wipe out everything that is below them in the pecking order, everything that was recorded after them. And that would include us. So that risk isn't compatible with our requirement to have the easements be perpetual. And that's why we can't do that. So that has been a sticking point for some people. That's why I say it's great if you can kind of look into this stuff now with your lender, because if you have a bank that most of them come around to the idea, but if it's a hard no from them, then that can kind of torpedo your chances of actually using the money, even if you do receive an award. So it's really important. Sometimes it's out of our hands, but like I said, we do try to help people navigate that process to the extent possible as a third party. But yeah, that's when it can take a long time. Usually, it's not years, but it could be a few months if our legal staff have maybe 10 awards that were given that year and they all require a new easement. It can take them a little while to draft them, but it's generally not years unless there's an issue with the title. So thank you. I'll go ahead and keep chugging along now, and then I'll come back and check on the chat in a few minutes. So now I'm going through the application. If you want to open that up and follow along, that would be great. A few notes on the application this year. You'll see here, different from all of the previous 13 years that we've been doing this, we're accepting them electronically only this year because we are all still working remotely. It's much harder. The logistics of receiving a big, packet of physical application with attachments, making sure that it's processed by staff who, admin staff who may only be in the office one day a week, and then scanned, and then, making sure that the scans didn't miss a page. There are just many points of potential failure in that process that we're trying to avoid, both for staff and for applicants, because we want to make sure that we're getting everything that you're sending. So because of that, we're trying to move to a electronic only application system this year. So the application form that you've received, and if you haven't received it somehow, it is available on our website, and you can feel free to reach out to me afterwards and I can send it to you. But it is a fillable PDF form. So you can fill it out on your computer and then, save it and then just attach that to an email and send it to us. Or you can print it out, fill it out by hand, whatever's easiest for you. We're not going to, nobody's losing points on this because it was handwritten, as long as it's, still clear and concise and all of that stuff. Then we're asking people to send them to this email address here, which is historicpreservation@ppd.mncppc.org. And I'll put that at the end. And I believe it's in the application instructions as well. And then we're also asking people to reference, have your subject line be kind of standardized for these so that you're referencing the Historic Property Grant Program in your application email, and then either using the property name if your historic site has a name, or the property address if it does not in the email subject line. So, for example, if I were sending one in for the town of Bladensburg for the Bostwick House, it would be Historic Property Grant Program, dash Bostwick House, or whatever the case may be. I also know that because of the attachments that are required, you're going to have contractor estimates, you're going to have photos, things like that. And I know that, there could be issues with attachment sizes. So we're also perfectly open if you're more comfortable using a service like Dropbox or Google Drive or Microsoft OneDrive or what, one of these cloud services, to send us a link that has just a folder of your application and all the attachments. That's fine too. We can definitely work with that, and we'll confirm receipt of it with you. But if you're not comfortable with that and you need to send multiple emails to get all of the attachments in, that's fine. But we do ask that you please use the same subject line on all of your messages, so that they can kind of be, Microsoft Outlook will do a lot of the work for us, thread those together so that we make sure we have all of the messages from you related to your application in one place, which will make it much easier for staff to properly sort of check everything in, make sure that we've got everything that we need for your application to be complete, and just to avoid any attachments slipping through the cracks. And then we're also toward that effort asking that you clearly label attachments so that if you've scanned a PDF or something to send as one of your budget attachments, we don't. We can obviously figure out what things are, but it just will be a little simpler if we don't have to kind of click every one and say, okay, file 1234 is this, estimate that goes with this line item on the budget. It's much easier, I think, for everybody if we can kind of very quickly see, okay, there's 5 attachments. This person has listed them out and told us what they all are. So if you can't change a file name, but would rather just simply list them out and say, well, file 1234.pdf is my estimate from the window guy, or whatever the case may be, that's great too. But it would be absolutely wonderful and lovely if we had this list of attachments so that we know what you meant to send. If something doesn't come through for whatever reason, we can very quickly identify that, and we can say, well, you said that you were sending 6 things, we only received 4, and we can kind of triage that much more quickly and easily, instead of, if we don't know that you sent 6 to begin with, then we might think that that's, all that you intended to send. So just to try to clear up any confusion, we're asking people to do all of these things with their application this year. And I think that'll make it easier for everybody, I hope, to kind of navigate this slightly updated process. Let's see. So now I'll just kind of get into the step-by-step stuff on the application. Bear with me. This is probably kind of obvious, but just in case it's not. So item number 1 is the historic property name and address. If you have a name, again, for your historic site, go ahead and put that here. If you don't, just put the address, and we can work with that, look you up, verify the eligibility of the property. Number 2, we are asking for a defining photograph of your property here. The form should work to let you click on this field and actually pick a file to attach as a representative photo right here. So if that works, that's great. But otherwise, we're also requesting 6 pages, or no more than 6 pages rather, of and 8.5 by 11 pages of good, clear, well-proportioned photographs that document the exterior conditions of the property and the interior if you're requesting funds for the interior. So if you can't get this photo to attach here, you can include it with those. But we do want to have one photo, even if your application is just about the chimney or just about the roof. If we could have one good photo that shows the whole property, so that the people reviewing the applications can say, oh, okay, and just get a sense of what the property looks like at a sort of pulled back level, that would be really helpful. As for the rest of the photos, we want to make sure that they are showing the specific issues that your grant application is intended to address. So, if it is a project to rehabilitate windows, we want to see, show us all the putty falling off of your windows, or show us missing panes of glass. Make sure that they're labeled. So all these photo pages should be labeled with the name and address of the property, the date the photos were taken, and a brief description of what each photo captures, so that we know, this is, if we're proposing to rehabilitate 10 windows, it's nice to know which ones we're looking at, or which group of them we're looking at. So for this representative photo here, you might say, you might have a close-up of these 3 windows. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but hopefully you can. And you could simply say, well, these are, when you're facing the south elevation of this house, these are to the left of the front door, and it's that group of windows. And it's good for us to know, so that we can, when the money is ultimately spent, we can say, yes, these 3 windows have been restored, and we know what they looked like before because they were in the application. And now we can see very clearly that the funds were spent the way that they were supposed to be, and that these windows are now in much better condition. And there's also an example of what this should look like at the back of the application instructions. I think it's the page after the Secretary's standards. So feel free to use that as a reference. And then also those supplemental photo pages that were attached to your confirmation email. That's a new thing that we're doing this year, just to try to make the digital submission easier. But those should hold about 2 4x6 photos on each page, which again, you should be able to click on the little rectangular field for the photo, select an attachment, a file to drop in there. And then underneath, there's a little rectangle for you to type in a caption, so you can fill them out in the way that they need to be formatted easily. But you don't have to use those. If it's easier for you to throw them all into a Word document, or whatever, and then save that as a PDF, that's perfectly fine. Whatever is easiest for you is absolutely fine. So the next step is the amount of funding requested, which should not be more than $50,000. So this is not the total project cost necessarily, which would include, of course, at the very least, your match, the amount of matching funds. But this is the amount that you are asking for as a grant award. So just be careful with that. Applicant contact information. We want somebody, especially if you're an organization and you have multiple people, pick one person who can be our point of contact for sort of responding to questions and concerns about the application. Someone that we can reach out to via email. That's going to be the easiest way for us to contact people. But phone number is great too, so that we can, again, as soon as we have your application in hand, we can start reviewing it, and we can start going back and forth with this contact person. Doesn't necessarily have to be the property owner, but it certainly can be, and often is. So this is question number 5, the project description. We want a succinct description of the project here, and that's why this space is kind of the size that it is. The text will sort of shrink to fit into the space to a point, but don't let it get microscopic here. We really, you want to keep it succinct enough that it fits in this part of the form in a legible way. And if there are really fine-grained details about the work that we might need to understand, those generally end up being included in contractor estimates and proposals. So this is just for broad strokes. If you're doing a larger project, you might say in here that we're planning to restore the siding. And so you can break it down into steps. We're going to remove the siding, expose the original siding that's underneath. We're going to clean it. We're going to restore it. We're going to repaint it. There might be areas that need to be replaced. And that's kind of what we want here. It's just the very succinct description of work. If there are any unknowns, then that's great, because, so you might say, we have no idea how much of the original siding exists. And so our project may change once we actually start doing the work, and that's fine, and that's great, and this is a great place to tell us about it. But don't go crazy. If your project is part of a larger project, so say you're requesting $50,000 to do foundation repair and window rehabilitation, but you also are planning to spend another $50,000 doing a few other things, but that the grant isn't enough to cover that, but it's all kind of happening at the same time, you can certainly mention that. I think that's important, valuable information. You can mention it here, but you don't have to go into so much of the detail about the work that isn't grant funded. Really save this space for the work that you're specifically asking for grant funds to pay for, and that would be helpful. And then if you do have a larger project that you want to bring up with more detail, question 8 is a good place to expand upon that a little bit. So just keep that in mind. This is your budget area. So this is where we are going to talk about how much your project, you know, should cost, how much you think it is going to cost. You're obviously, the award amount is limited to $50,000 or whatever ends up being awarded. But you know, none of this necessarily is fixed. We know that things can change. So if you get a $50,000 grant award and your budget ends up being kind of upside down, and it turns out that once they start taking the siding off, to use the siding example, um, there's much more rehabilitation, minor carpentry work that needs to be done than you expected. That's okay. I mean, it will have to come from somewhere else in the budget, but we're not going to say, no, 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 you only allocated $2,000 for the siding and the rest of it was for something else. So it is flexible. But having said that, we do want to see a really well thought out budget. If you have more than one type of work item, try to make each one discrete so that the planning board, has the option if they have to award partial grants to try to spread the money out a little bit more. This gives them a much easier way to do that. They can say, well, we can fund your roof, but maybe we can't fund the siding or whatever the case may be. But 6 lines should probably be enough. If you want to have a little more space and attach a budget, an Excel sheet that kind of matches this template, you can certainly do that, but do try to keep it in this same format so that everything is sort of standardized and easier to review. So really quickly, I'll go through the totals down at the bottom. So on the left here, you see there's 2 totals that are highlighted in gray. And the one that I've got the little red box around now is the total amount of funding requested. So that should match the number that's on page 1. Then we've got a total that is your total project cost. And this could be anything, really. I mean, it's got to be more than the total grant requested. It should at least have that 10% extra in it. But, again, you could be doing a lot of work, and this grant is just sort of part of that, and that's fine. So, that should be reflected here so that we know and that the reviewers know, well, this person's doing a big project and this grant funding is just to sort of help make it more bearable. That's fine and that's good, and we like to see that. The middle of this table is for your applicant contribution, so that's your match, whether it's cash, in kind, donated. Keep that all in here. And then let me really quickly, I'll show you an example here. And I think there's another one that is in the application instructions that you can review. But here's a quick one of a kind of, multi-item project. So they're doing a few things. It's kind of an exterior rehab in general. They're doing window repair and repainting their front door. And they've got it broken down into separate things. So ideally, and this may not be possible, but ideally we would love to see, so for line item 1, window repair and reglazing, we know that it costs $11,000 total. We would love to see a contractor estimate or contractor proposal that says, here's what we're going to do, and it's going to cost $11,000, so that we have an estimate that lines up with each line item of the budget. And then, of course, some of that is your match. Some of it is not. Some of it is going to become the award. So this is a $13,000 project, and the total cost is $14,300, which meets the match, which is $1,300. So it actually exceeds that. And you may want to leave line items in here if you don't have your easement recorded. It's usually not quite $1,000, but that's a good placeholder amount. And this is the title examination and the settlement for the easement. We hire an outside title attorney to do all that for us, and so we can pay him directly from the grant award. But it's good for you to know that in advance, because if you get a $50,000 award, you may, after his work has been done, you may only have $49,000 remaining. And then that property survey that I mentioned before, again, it really generally for most suburban properties at least won't come close to being $1,000. I think this year for the sort of smaller suburban properties, it's like 300 or so for a location drawing, I think is what they call it. But anyway, so this is just one way that your budget could look. Again, we do want to see estimates for as many things as possible. Estimates are a great example of the kind of information that you might send after the fact. So Maybe your contractors that you're reaching out to are slammed because so many people are applying to the grant program that they're getting lots of requests and they can't get you an estimate. Maybe they can't come out and do one until after October 16th. That's fine. You know, maybe get a ballpark number from them to put in your budget, and then make sure you get that estimate before November 20th so that you can update your budget if necessary, and all that stuff. That's the kind of information that, if it's kind of out of your hands and you can't get that stuff early enough, you can certainly supplement with that. You can get as many estimates as you want, but please only include one. We don't need to see that you went to 4 or 5 different people and picked the cheapest. You don't have to pick the cheapest. We certainly want to make sure that work is being done as high quality as possible. So keep that in mind. But yeah, if there is a line item on your budget that does not have a estimate backing it up, that is something that our reviewers are probably going to be drawn to and possibly, be a little suspicious of. So keep that in mind. These people are professionals. They kind of have an idea of how much things cost. So that's why we try to get people to really have one estimate or proposal for each line item, because it's very easy to make sure that this thing is grounded in reality when you're starting. And again, just so that you know, submitting an estimate from any given contractor does not lock you in to using that contractor or bid. That's a question that comes up a lot. So, you may submit one for $11,000 from Jimmy's Window Restoration Inc. But maybe in the interim, couple of months that it takes to find out if you're getting an award, and then the time that it takes to do the easement, maybe you find someone, you meet someone that you think really does good work. You don't have to go with Jimmy's Window Rehabilitation Incorporated. You can certainly change that as long as they're a qualified contractor and are going to do the work to the same specifications, generally speaking. So, let us know. And obviously the caveat is that we have to see the work and make sure it was done correctly before you get reimbursed. So don't put in a high bid and then just go find someone who's unlicensed or unqualified to do the work, because then you run into an issue of possibly not getting reimbursed for it. But you are not necessarily locked into people just because they were the estimates that you put in with your application. So sorry, I didn't want to spend too much time on that, but try to keep moving along here so I don't take up the whole time. Really quickly, I wanted to go through the funding priorities and selection criteria. This is how your applications will be scored. It's out of 100 possible points. And, through the application, you can only really speak to some of these. Some of these are just inherent in the project or in the property itself. So as I go through these slides, you'll see that some of these have red numbers sort of overlaid on them. Those correspond to questions in the application that you can actually respond to and provide a response to. These other ones that are sort of outlined in this pale blue color with a grayish tan background, those are ones that you can't really speak to in your application. They are what they are based on your property. But you still get scored on them. So I'll try to provide some explanation of them here for your benefit. So for number 7, historical and cultural significance of the resource. This is where you can talk about what is historically or culturally significant about your property. If your property is already a historic site, you can just kind of copy and paste the summary paragraph on significance from your inventory form. And if you don't have that, don't know where to find it, just reach out to me and I can send it to you. And you can literally copy and paste that. There's no point, trying to reinvent the wheel or anything like that. So it's nice and easy for you. If your property hasn't been surveyed yet, if it's a contributing structure in a National Register district that doesn't have a lot of documentation about it, you may have to do your own research to get significance, to figure out what that is, and that's fine too. But just so you know, if you're not already a historic site, that question may be a little bit harder to answer. Number 8, this is the one that I mentioned before when talking about your summary project description. This question is the urgency of need for financial assistance. And what this doesn't mean is like your personal financial situation, which can be kind of confusing because that's a little bit what it sounds like. But the planning board is actually not allowed, they're forbidden from evaluating anyone's personal financial situation in the process of making these determinations for who gets awards. What we're really trying to get to with this is, is there some unique window of opportunity to undertake the rehabilitation of this particular project or property at this time, maybe you have additional funding that's available, and being able to leverage this additional up to $50,000 would really be a big help, or whatever the case may be. But so that's why this is a great place. If you do have a larger project that this is a part of, you could talk about that here, or whatever else might be making this urgent. The next question is one that you can't really speak to. Again, the historical and cultural diversity, and basically what we're trying to get to here. It's only out of 5 points, so don't worry, it can't hurt you too much. But they're trying to determine, out of the pool of applicants, does your property's historical and cultural significance make it sort of stand out from the rest of them? Diversity of resource types is a similar question. Let's say you have an 18th century church and all the other applicants are late 19th century, Queen Anne houses. You, the 18th century church, would get a slightly higher score out of, only these 5 points, but still, those other properties might get a 2 and you might get a 5 because you are the only type of resource that is, it's a unique resource type for the application pool. The next ones are equitable countywide distribution of funds, which is worth up to 10 points, and then neighborhood reinvestment area. And I'm going to switch to another slide for those really quickly, because those have to do with geographic distribution. So this is an example of a map from 2 years ago, where you can see we received 20 applications with a large concentration, this little pop-out map here in the northern part of the county around the Hyattsville area. So if you were in that area, if you were one of those people that had to have a pop-out map done, it was really intense geographic competition there, and those folks might have only got 2 points. But then these outliers way down here that have no one else applying near them, they might get 5 points for that category, simply because of the geography. We want to try to make sure that all of this grant money isn't just going to one part of the county. And so that's kind of the intent here. And same with the transforming neighborhoods initiatives, or neighborhood reinvestment areas, which are these sort of purple blobs on the map. I don't know if you can make those out. If your property is in one of those, you get an additional couple of points. But if you're not, you don't, and you just get 0 points for that. But it's not worth so much that it's going to totally hurt you to not be in one of those areas. This year, you can see none of the applications were from those areas, and yet we still managed to give all of the money away, and and then some. So there was still more of a demand than we could fulfill. So don't worry about applying if you're not in a TNI, but if you are, know that it'll help you out just a little bit to try to make the funding more equitable geographically. The next question is number 9, the retention of historically significant materials or details. So if your property has extensive or original materials, features, and finishes, are you taking the extra effort to retain them, keep them intact, restore them rather than replace them? That's what this question's about. And of course, not every project is going to be about the retention of historically significant material or details. A new roof, if you're replacing an existing asphalt shingle roof with a new one, that's not, and that's fine. It doesn't need to be. But if it is, this is a great place to highlight that because it can help make your project stand out. Number 10 is the the provision for long-term resource preservation. So, the work that you're asking for funding for, is that going to keep this historic property standing for far longer? So in some cases, this is really obvious. Again, a roof, which may not be a high scoring project under criteria 9 for this number 10 question, that's great because having a roof that's leaking is going to deteriorate that property so much faster than having a roof and a building envelope that is intact. So it's a great place to highlight whatever you're doing. Maybe you're doing foundation work, almost anything that you could apply for this program, like anything that would be eligible is probably going to provide some sort of long-term resource preservation benefit. So just really highlight that for us, whatever it is. And it may not be the whole project. It might be one of the line items in particular, but this is a great place to highlight that. Number 11 is the extent to which the project will stimulate or promote other preservation activities. This, to me, is kind of the hardest one to answer. And again, it's not worth a ton of points, so don't lose sleep over it. And it's also the kind of thing that will be kind of gleaned from the overall application, But, if there is some specific thing about your project that will accomplish the goal of sort of promoting preservation activities throughout the community or county, please, let us know what that is. That's great. Maybe you're going to do a blog about it, about your rehabilitation project or something like that to publicize it. That's fantastic, and that's really cool. And this is a great place to let us know. But again, it's not going to make or break it, as long as the rest of your application is pretty well put together. Number 12 is your readiness to complete the project. Are you ready to start? Do you have the funds necessary to begin immediately? Do you have a clear title on the property? Have you started talking to your lender? All those sorts of things. You can touch upon them here. The next one, number 13, is administrative capability. And again, this is something that we're going to see throughout the application. Is it neat? Are the answers thorough and complete? Is the budget well organized with good backup documentation to justify the costs? That's all going to kind of come together for your administrative capability score. But you can also talk about any specific qualifications that you have. Maybe you've project managed before, or whatever the case may be. And you can certainly highlight that stuff here as well. Number 14 is demonstrated community interest and support. This is your chance to kind of show that people in your community are supportive and invested in this project and the rehabilitation of whatever the historic resource is. It's kind of quality over quantity, I would say. Definitely there's no need to attach more than 5, which is the number of spaces that we allow for that. On the form, you just write in who the person is, their name and their title, and then you can attach those 5 letters to your application. And it's great. Reach out to elected officials, your county council people. If you're in a municipality, you could reach out to your mayor, historical society, whatever the case may be. Those are all great potential people to have write letters for you here, and they can submit their letters electronically to you, and then you can include them in your application. That's the best way to go about doing that. For your reference, even though everything is going to be coming to us directly at the historic preservation section, if they want to, write these like a traditional letter and have an address block, it could be addressed to the Prince George's County Planning Board, since they are the ones that ultimately make the decision. So, and if you have questions about that later on, feel free to ask me in the process of getting them together. But I can provide you with that information if you want their address and the planning board chair's name, which is Elizabeth Hewlett. I can give you all that too for addressing these. Although it may be in the application instructions now that I think about it, but if it's not, let me know and I can give that to you. The next part of the application, number 15, is the property owner certification. So again, you may not be the property owner filling this out. The property owner may not want to be the point of contact for whatever reason, but we do need to know that they are aware that this is happening and that they're on board with it, because ultimately they're going to be the ones that have to sign this easement and donate it to M-NCPPC. So this is where they would sign off, just acknowledging, all this fine print here, that they're, aware of the terms and conditions. They've looked through this stuff and they know what's going on. If there's more than one property owner, we do have a second field for that. If there are more than 2 people listed as property owners, let me know. We'll just figure out how to get a record of that going in our application database. But don't worry about it. We can sort that out. I don't think it's come up in a number of years. If you're a church or a municipality, then you would skip 15 and 15 part 2 and go right on to number 16, the corporate resolution. Only sign that if you're signing on behalf of a corporation, and make sure that this is an individual within the, someone who is eligible, who is allowed to be signing important things and making agreements for the organization. And it's good to have their name too, in addition to the contact person, because again, they're going to be the ones who we need to put down as the contact person for the easement to sign off on that. So, yeah. Really quickly, I was going to go through a couple of very brief examples of some successful applications, so you can get an idea of what those might look like and the kind of work that they propose to do. And then I'll also give you my quick spiel about how to make your application successful. Very quickly, this is the Black Swamp School in Brandywine, Maryland. They came in and they removed synthetic siding. They removed a later addition at the rear of the building, which you can kind of see used to be here and is now not. They got it up off the ground on these brick piers, added the chimney back in that used to be there, fixed, restored the original wood siding and repainted it, put a new roof on. So this was a long process, but they got that all taken care of. Let's see. Oh, there we go. This is the Oatlands in Laurel, and you can see before and after. They're still working on it. It remains a work in progress, but they did a lot of repointing to that very substantial amount of masonry that makes up the house. They also have done a lot of window repair and roof repair to get it to a much better condition than it was in when they first came into the program. This is Perkins Chapel in Glendale, and you can see there they restored the siding, stripped it down to bare wood with infrared speed heaters, like really took off all of the old paint that was alligatored, flaking off, put a new roof on the property, and then when they were doing the repainting of the siding, they also did that with the windows, full window rehabilitation with the historic ones, down to bare wood, weather stripped, and now they are these beautifully functional historic original windows, which is fantastic. And then one last one here, which is the Claggett House at Cool Spring Manor, and this is a ongoing one. These are property owners that have come back to the well multiple times, so to speak, and the property was in really, really poor condition when they came to own it, and they have since done just about everything that you can think of. A lot of structural stuff, a lot of exterior stuff, masonry work on the foundation, new chimneys, restored windows, restored siding, rebuilding the porches to their original appearance, new shutters that were, sort of custom built to match the style of the building. And now they've moved on to doing interior work, which is really fascinating. So, not every project has to have this many things, and obviously it's great if your property is starting off in a sort of better place than this one was. But if it's not, this gives you some sense of, like, even if you can't do everything that you want to do with one $50,000 grant, it can be a really good sort of long-term program to come back to, and partner with us in rehabilitating your historic property. Really quick, I want to just sort of give you my cheesy spiel on how to make a good application. And the silly little easy to remember thing that I've come up with is the 3 C's. So you want your application to be clear, concise, and compelling. Remember that the grant program is competitive and that the decision makers, like, not me and the other staff that will be reviewing these and kind of helping you through the application process, but the planning board, the Historic Preservation Commission, they're only going to have, they all kind of are volunteering their time to review and score these leading up to the planning board. And so they only have so much time to spend on each application. That's why we really want you to use and we'll only accept applications that come in on the official application form, because we need them to be standardized so that these people can kind of get through them quickly and be able to easily differentiate the projects. So, the more concise and everything that they can be, the better chance that they'll stand out, and the better your odds of getting an award will be. So that's that. I'm gonna really quickly. I know that the end time for this was advertised as 3:30, and I will try to stick to that. And by all means, you're welcome to drop off if you need to. But I do have the sort of virtual meeting space booked until 4. So don't worry. I apologize that this has taken a little longer for me to get through, but I will make sure that there's time at the end for questions. I just really quickly want to go through that easement with you, because that is a fairly critical part of this whole thing. Like I said, you can't get access to any of the funds until this crucial step has taken place. So there is a sort of frequently asked questions about the easement document included in this. And I, again, will hopefully have a sort of sample easement that I can send to you all shortly if I have your email address from your registration. But very quickly, an easement is a private, voluntary legal agreement wherein a property owner, which in this case is you, the grantor, transfers certain property rights to a qualified easement holding organization, which is M-NCPPC, or the grantee for the purposes of the easement, which gets to be very confusing because for the award, you are the grantee as you have received a grant from the commission. But when we're talking about the easement, we are the grantee because you are granting the easement to us. So apologies in advance for that because it never stops being confusing. The way that this easement is sort of presents itself is via what essentially is a deed. It gets recorded in the land records like a deed. It is called an easement, but it functions in very much the same way that a deed of trust might, with the exception that with most deeds of trusts, there is a specific period of time when you've paid off the note, and those deeds of trusts are resolved, and they are removed from the land records, and another document gets recorded saying that the deed of trust was sort of resolved. In this case, these are perpetual easements that are binding and enforceable covenants on the property in perpetuity, and they continue on to subsequent property owners. So if you leave the property to family, if you move out in a few years and sell the property, the easement will show up in a title search, and it is required to disclose the easement when you're selling the property. Your agent should disclose that to potential buyers, and the buyer's agent should also be disclosing that to people, which is true with being a historic site as well. So if you're not already a historic site, that's something to keep in mind. And in practice, the easement kind of works a lot like being a historic site, which again, most people that apply already are, but if you're not, you will have to become one. So some of the covenants that come along with this easement are, they would obligate. I'll jump back to this one, but it obligates the property owners and subsequent owners to refrain from certain actions, demolition, for example, and to seek approval from M-NCPPC for other actions that would change the appearance of the property, or if you were building an addition, major landscaping that would change the environmental setting. All that stuff would have to be approved in advance by M-NCPPC for the easement. As a historic site, all of that would be approved in advance by the Historic Preservation Commission, which is a county body. So, both of those things kind of happen in tandem. The easement can be a little bit more restrictive potentially than the historic site designation that are enforced via Subtitle 29, but they can't be in conflict with each other. And generally speaking, they are very much the same in practice, with the exception being that, Subtitle 29 is legislation that was created by the Prince George's County Council. It's part of the county's, overall code of ordinances. There is the possibility that in the future, the political winds could change. We could get a very different council that for some reason wants to get rid of Subtitle 29 or amend it in some way to alter it. And perhaps our historic preservation program in the county changes to the point where, there is no more oversight over historic sites through Subtitle 29. In that scenario, which is unlikely but possible, this easement would still stand because it is a private agreement. So that's the key difference. Even though in practice for the majority of people, there's very little practical difference between being a historic site and being a historic site that has an easement from M-NCPPC. That is the one kind of key thing to keep in mind. We are not subject to the political winds. This agreement is sort of set in stone the moment that it is executed, and with the one exception being if you never take the money and we mutually agree to dissolve the easement. So that's it. It is, I don't want to undersell the importance or permanence of it in any way by comparing it to Subtitle 29, but just to give you some sense of that, the relationship between those two different types of regulatory oversight that a successful applicant would ultimately have. The easement does not constitute an ownership of the property by M-NCPPC. It is a required condition of receiving the grant award through the Historic Property Grant Program. and it does require M-NCPPC to routinely monitor the property to ensure adherence. So we usually come out once a year for an annual inspection, which again, if the easement only covers the exterior, this is exterior only. We try to do it in such a way that is convenient to the property owners. We give them a couple weeks notice with a suggested date, with the flexibility to change it. And they also have the flexibility whether or not to actually meet with us on site when we come. So the choices are yours in terms of that. And it also provides the property owners with some technical assistance from M-NCPPC staff, because when we go out there, we're not just going out there to make sure that you didn't, build a new addition or something like that, which is part of it, but we're also out there to look for potential issues. And we may find things that are going to become problems down the road, and we may be able to bring them to your attention earlier, just by having another set of eyes out there, once or twice a year. So it can be beneficial in that way as well. Interior protections are not typical. I'm going to jump back to this slide. I made this graphic to try to sort of explain how our easements can be customized. And why we have them. The text is why we have them. It's because we're giving this public money to a privately owned property. And so we need to make sure that it is handled appropriately and spent in the way that it is meant to be spent. And the way that we do that is by having these easements, because we want to make sure that, maybe you're very invested in this historic site, but when you sell the property, if the new owner comes in and undoes all of the work that you spent this grant funding on, then that would be kind of a waste of the taxpayers' money. So we have these easements in place to make sure that that does not happen. And then what this graphic is supposed to represent is a sort of orthogonal view of, we're at an angle looking down at a parcel, in plan view, which would normally be a rectangle, but in this case, it's sort of skewed at an angle so you can see the layers. The gray outline is a historic structure, a house, and then there happens to be a non-historic structure on the property. Maybe it's a shed or a barn or a garage. When we're negotiating the terms of these easements, if that non-historic structure is there, then don't worry. We're not going to make you start putting, historic wood windows in your garage or whatever the case may be. We do have ways to customize these so that while the entire area of the parcel is protected by the easement, we may specifically exclude certain buildings or features that it would be inappropriate to hold to the same standard as the rest of the property. So that's something that we can work out with you once we get to that point in the process, once we have the site plan. That's why that site plan is so important for us, so that we can see all of the structures and features that are on the property. And then sort of in consultation with the property owner and in going out there and documenting the property for the easement baseline, we will kind of come to an agreement on which specific property elements need to be protected and at what level, because there are various, ways to handle that within the easement. We can exclude a structure so that it is not regulated by the easement at all. We can, have it be not mentioned, but within the easement protected area, so that, this building might not be historic and we might not make you retain the windows on it in the way that they are, or we might not care if you change the siding material of it. But if you're going to increase the footprint into this yellow area or build an addition and increase the volume of that building, that would obviously still, because of its potential impacts on the primary structure, be of interest to us and require approval. So I know that this is all very confusing, or it can be rather, with the easement stuff. So certainly if you have any questions or concerns about that, do let me know. It doesn't have to be right now. I'll put up my email at the end here so that you can jot that down. And I'll go back to this in a few minutes, but I'll leave it up for now. And then at the very end, I'll give you a quick rundown on that blue side that I just skipped over, which is about our non-capital grants. I'm gonna hold on that for now to give people time for questions before we hit the 3:30 mark, in case anyone needs to jump off. Yeah, if anyone's interested, please stick around for that and I'll let you know more about that. But if anyone has questions, please feel free to jump in. If you can unmute yourself, please do. If you can't unmute yourself, let me know in the chat and I can unmute you if you'd like to ask the question in your own voice. But if not, I can certainly read it as well. So thank you. Now I'm going to take a big drink of water. Well, I'm not seeing any questions yet, no raised hands or anything like that. So while I wait to see if there are any, I'll jump back and very quickly tell you all about this, which may or may not be of interest. If you are a nonprofit, it might be more relevant to you. But we maybe a year or two ago at this point just rolled out a new non-capital grant program. It's a little different from the capital grant program. It is funding that is controlled by the Historic Preservation Commission rather than the Planning Board. So that's one key difference. It also is not tied to a budget year, so it doesn't have the same kind of fixed application cycle that we have with the capital grant program. So for this, you can kind of submit applications anytime, and they get reviewed as soon as possible, basically, whenever the next Historic Preservation Commission meeting is. It's, the other key difference is that it is for non-capital stuff. So for the capital grant program, which is we call the Historic Property Grant Program, that is for brick and mortar work on historic sites. This one's a little more flexible because you can do work that's related to historic sites, but it's non-capital in nature. It cannot be used for capital expenses. But if you needed to prepare a plan, a historic, maybe a historic site report or something like that, an HSR, architectural designs, resource surveys, archaeology, things like that. If you wanted to do, if you're a nonprofit that does programming that's related to history, or if you are you could be a church that wants to maybe talk about the history of the church and the congregation, and you wanted to put together a brochure or a website or a walking tour with a couple of related sites. Those are all great grant projects rather for the non-capital program. It's a slightly smaller program. We give grants at two levels. So one is $5,000 or less, and we call those mini grants. For mini grants, there is no match requirement. So that's perfect, again, for something like one of these brochures, maybe. You could hire a historian to do a little research for you and then pay, a couple $100 for printing and maybe produce a nice brochure for under $5,000 and not really have to spend too much of your own money on that. If it's more than $5,000, up to $25,000, I think is what our current limit is, there is a 50-50 match requirement for every dollar spent over $5,000. So, for example, if you got a $6,000 grant, instead of the $5,000, we don't make you match the whole $6,000 because we know that if you had, been able to keep it at $5,000 or less, there would have been no match. So you only have to provide the 50-cent match on that additional $1,000. So for a $6,000 application, the total budget would be, $6,500, I guess, because it's $500 for that $1,000 of additional funding, if that makes sense. And for more information on this, you can go to the same website that all of our capital grant information is on, which is listed there, http://pgplanning.org/466/grants. And all the application materials are on here. Again, this is not as sort of timely as the capital grant program. You can sort of submit at your leisure. And we can go from there. And if you have any questions about this, you can let me know. I'll put my contact information back up. One thing I did want to mention for you for this year, there is a phone number here, which is my number. As I mentioned at the top of the presentation, myself and all of my colleagues are working remotely still currently due to the pandemic and sort of all that comes along with that. So this year, certainly the best and fastest way to correspond with us would be email, if you can do that. If you can pick a contact person for your application that can respond to email, if it's not something that you're comfortable with, that would be great, just so that we can have a very quick and easy back and forth with people. I also am going to be on leave starting. I have some planned family medical leave in early October. So I'm asking folks, you can certainly reach out to me directly and I am happy to respond, but that's why I'm listing this historic preservation address. This is the one that applications should go to, so that if you submit an application sometime after the beginning of October. It doesn't languish in my inbox, which I will try to check as much as possible, but my colleagues will be able to get back to you much more quickly at the historic preservation address. So certainly if you're going to send it to one place, send it to that, and I can follow up with you from that address up until I'm on leave, and then you'll be in my colleagues' capable hands after that point. But yeah, I don't know if anyone else. Oh, I see some questions in the chat. Sorry if you've been waiting long for that. Let's see. I've got from 320. Will someone be penalized for not keeping up with the easement work? That's a good question. And I guess I want to make sure I'm answering the correct thing. So my interpretation of this question is, I guess what you're asking is if you get a grant to do X, Y, and Z, let's say a new roof, restore the windows, whatever, will you be penalized if you don't do that work? No, the answer is no. You won't ever receive the grant money until the work gets done. But to the extent that the conditions don't deteriorate, you would not be penalized. Now, if the work never happens and the property conditions deteriorate and the easement has been recorded and the property is a historic site, there is an existing mechanism in subtitle 29 for any historic sites, even those without easements, that's known as demolition by neglect. So if a property were to sort of sit there and just completely deteriorate, there are penalties potentially for that. And similarly, under the easement, we do what's called baseline documentation. So staff go out there leading up to the settlement of the easement, and we take detailed photographs. We key them to the site plan that you submit to us. And then that is recorded in the land records along with the easement. It's one of the exhibits. So we have a snapshot of what the conditions of the property were when the easement was recorded. And the easement allows us to proactively make sure that the conditions do not get any worse than they were when the easement was recorded. We expect them to get better, so they can certainly always improve with permission in advance. But that's the one kind of way that you can be penalized for work not being done. But certainly if it just takes you a while to start the grant funded work, there are deadlines, so you may miss out on the money. But if conditions just sort of remained the same without getting much worse, then no, you wouldn't be necessarily penalized for not doing the grant funded work. And let me know if I'm not answering your intended question, and I can try to answer what you really meant to ask. But I hope that covers at least part of it. In the meantime, I'm going to jump on to the next question I see here from Sachin. If the property is a residence and we request grant for updates to the house, does the easement or historic preservation requirement apply to the yard or garden, and to what extent? Yes, this is a great question. As a historic site, so anyone that is already a historic site, if you don't know this, every historic site has what's called an environmental setting, which is defined in the subtitle in the legislation. So the HPC and planning department staff acting as staff for the HPC, we do regulate the property as well, like the yard, the garden. Generally, it's to a lesser degree than the house. The house there's usually a primary historic feature of the historic site, and that's generally speaking a house or a building of some sort. And that is, of course, our greatest priority. But the subtitle does allow us to regulate the parcel, usually, especially for sort of suburban properties, Hyattsville, Mount Rainier. It is the entire parcel that the property is on. And it doesn't mean that you can't plant a vegetable garden or plant flowers in your garden or do things like that. But what we want to try to avoid is things that would, and this is for the easement as well, because this is how the easements are generally written to be in harmony with subtitle 29. So for both of those conditions, whether just as a historic site or as a historic site that also has an easement, we want to prevent things like the planting of a row of Italian cypress trees that are 10 feet tall and that function as a huge fence in front of the property, so you can no longer see the house. Because for us, having the historic site be visually accessible to the public is part of why it's worth putting money into to rehabilitate it. So if the money gets spent to rehabilitate the property and then the property owner hides the property from the public right of way in some way that it was not previously like that already, that would be a problem. If you're on a big rural property and part of it is forested, just heavily planted trees, and you clear cut that, that would be an issue. It's not to say that you couldn't apply for permission to do that and then have us review it in advance and make sure that it is compatible with all of the local zoning regulations and things like that. But it's stuff that you couldn't do without permission. So yes, we do regulate the yard, garden, but generally it is a little bit more flexible than the main house. But certainly, if you were building, talking about building an accessory structure within that environmental setting of the yard or the parcel, then that would be something we would have to approve. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers your questions. But again, if not, please come back into the chat or send me an email, whatever is easiest. Question from James. Can you share the non-capital grant information on your previous slide? Oh, yes, I can. And I will. And here that is. And another thing to note about this, I guess, I don't think anyone in here is like a developer, but there are certain things like archaeology that is sometimes required through the subdivision process, things like that. That type of work and archaeology, while it is the kind of work that would generally be applicable and covered by non-capital grants, if it's part of a sort of a regulatory process, we won't fund it. But if you had a property with a cemetery on it and you wanted to do some work on the cemetery or something like that, or research, that's the kind of thing that would be great for this. And I know James, you do have that. So
yep. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. So yeah, I'm I guess the formal presentation is over, so I will not be offended if anyone drops off at this point, but I can stick around for a bit if anyone else has any questions. If you need me to unmute you, let me know. And if it's quiet for a few minutes, then I'll probably wrap this up and end the presentation. But certainly I'm at your disposal via email. Whatever you need, let me know. If you have problems with any of the application materials, the forms, if you read through the instructions and something just doesn't make sense to you, please reach out to me. Obviously, the sooner the better. And same with your applications. If the deadline is October 16th, I believe I said it was. But yes, so that doesn't mean you have to wait. Oh yes, hello.
Yes, this is Sam Whitaker.
Hi.
What is the date on the non-capital grants? I don't see a timeline.
So for the non-capital grants, there isn't as much of a set date. There's really no deadline. We when we get them, and we just kind of go from there. The funding that funds the non-capital grant program isn't tied to a fiscal year, so it's sort of that money is there, and we can it can be tapped into whenever one of these gets approved. So if you send one in, generally the deadlines are it's a rolling kind of thing, but because they get approved and heard by the Historic Preservation Commission, that body meets every month except August, and they meet on the third Tuesday of every month. So let's say you wanted to be on the agenda for the October meeting, you would need to get your non-capital grant application to us by the third Tuesday in September, the previous month, to be on the following month's agenda. Like, if that makes any sense. And we try to do them as quickly as possible. So sometimes even if it's after the deadline, if it's quick enough and easy enough to review, we can still get them on the agenda if it's not too crowded already. But yeah, this non-capital program has a rolling application cycle, and it's really open until further notice, unlike the capital grant program, which this presentation is about, which is like very firmly only open for a couple months, August to October or whatever every year, and then it has a very cyclical annual process that has to happen. Yeah. Well, thank you all. Again, I'm not going to rush anyone out of here, but I did want to say thank you to everyone who's here, who has sort of hung in through that whole thing. I know it's a lot of information to throw at you, and I know that I can kind of drone on with these slides. So I appreciate everybody sort of bearing with me and trying to take it all in, trying to drink from the fire hose, as it were. And certainly, yeah, if you think of something, later today or tomorrow or whenever, I'm more than happy to respond as quickly as possible. Yeah, just try to help you out through the process as much as I can before I go on leave. And then again, when I am on leave, several people will be taking over in my stead, and you will be in good hands. So yeah, I guess I'll let everybody go unless anybody has any other questions. Thank you all so much, and I will reach out to you again if I get that a sample easement that I can share with you all from our legal staff sometime soon. I'll send that to you guys. And otherwise, I look forward to hearing from you and seeing what great grant applications you guys put together. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
You.
Yep, bye-bye.